For a country made up of thousands of islands, defending the coastline is an enormous challenge. The Philippines has thousands of kilometers of shoreline, major ports, important fishing grounds, critical sea lanes, and strategically located islands stretching between the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. That geography gives the country enormous maritime advantages, but it also creates a difficult defense problem. A hostile surface force does not necessarily have to approach a major naval base to create a threat. Ships could potentially operate far from the Philippine mainland while attempting to influence events around the country's maritime territory. So how can the Philippines defend such a huge area without depending entirely on its warships? One increasingly important answer is the development of land-based anti-ship missile forces. And now, the Philippine Army is looking at a major expansion. Under its integrated shore-based anti-ship missile system program, commonly associated with the ISBAMS effort, the Army is pursuing a much larger coastal defense capability, with plans reportedly pointing toward as many as 9 BrahMos batteries. If fully realized, this would represent a significant change in the way the Philippines approaches maritime defense. Instead of relying only on frigates, corvettes, patrol vessels, and aircraft to monitor and respond to threats at sea, the country could have multiple mobile missile units positioned across key areas of the archipelago. And that could fundamentally change the strategic value of the Philippine coastline. At first, it may seem unusual for the Philippine Army to operate anti-ship missiles. After all, ships are traditionally associated with naval warfare. But coastal defense has always been an important part of maritime strategy. A modern shore-based missile battery essentially turns selected portions of the coastline into potential defensive zones. The missile launchers remain on land, while surveillance systems and other military assets help provide information about activity at sea. The important advantage is mobility. Instead of placing the entire burden on a relatively small number of warships, mobile coastal defense units can operate from different locations and contribute to a broader defensive network. This becomes especially useful for an island nation. The Philippines does not have one continuous coastline that can be defended from a single location. It has islands spread across an enormous maritime area. That means defense planners have to think in terms of multiple strategic directions. The western side of the country faces the West Philippine Sea. The eastern side opens toward the Philippine Sea and the wider Pacific. The northern Philippines sits near strategically important approaches, while the southern islands connect several important maritime routes. A distributed coastal defense system could therefore provide another layer between potential threats and critical Philippine territory. At the center of this strategy is the BrahMos missile. The BrahMos is a supersonic cruise missile developed through cooperation between India and Russia. Its reputation comes largely from its speed and its role as an anti-ship weapon. Unlike a conventional subsonic cruise missile, a supersonic missile can cover the engagement distance much more quickly. That creates a difficult problem for a defending ship. Once a missile is detected, the crew may have significantly less time to understand the situation, determine the threat, coordinate defensive systems, and attempt to intercept the incoming weapon. This does not mean that a BrahMos is impossible to stop. Modern warships use radar, electronic warfare, decoys, and surface-to-air missiles to defend themselves. But speed can make the defensive problem considerably more demanding. And that is one reason the BrahMos is attracting attention as the Philippines develops its own coastal defense architecture. This is not completely new territory for the armed forces of the Philippines. The Philippine Army has already introduced BrahMos coastal defense systems into service. That initial capability was an important development because it gave the Philippines something it had historically lacked: a modern land-based weapon specifically designed to threaten hostile surface ships from shore. The next question is scale. Having one or a limited number of batteries provides a capability. Having a larger network distributed throughout the archipelago provides something very different. That is where the reported goal of 9 batteries becomes particularly significant. More batteries mean more potential coverage areas. It also means that the Army could potentially distribute its forces rather than concentrating its entire coastal defense capability around a small number of locations. For a geographically dispersed country, that distinction matters enormously. To understand the significance of the number 9, it is important to understand what a missile battery actually represents. A battery is not simply one launcher sitting beside a road. A complete missile unit can involve launch vehicles, command elements, communications equipment, targeting and surveillance assets, support vehicles, maintenance equipment, personnel, and logistics. The missile launcher is only one part of the larger system. That means expanding from a small number of batteries toward a much larger force is not simply a matter of buying additional missiles. The Philippines would also need trained crews, maintenance infrastructure, spare components, communications systems, transportation assets, and continuous exercises. The effectiveness of the system depends on how well all these elements work together. And this is where modernization becomes much more complicated than simply purchasing weapons. A missile battery cannot effectively engage something it cannot locate. That makes information just as important as the missile itself. Coastal defense depends on a wider network of sensors and surveillance capabilities. These can include maritime surveillance systems, radar, aircraft, drones, naval vessels, Coast Guard assets, and other sources of information. The objective is to develop a clearer picture of what is happening at sea. This is often described as maritime domain awareness. The more accurate and timely the information, the better commanders can understand the maritime environment. For the Philippine military, this is especially important because the country cannot afford to treat every unidentified vessel as a military threat. There are commercial ships, fishing boats, Coast Guard vessels, research vessels, and naval forces operating throughout the region. A modern defense network therefore requires identification and decision-making, as well as weapons. The missile is the final component of a much larger system. One of the biggest advantages of a mobile coastal defense system is that the launchers do not have to remain permanently exposed in one obvious location. Mobile units can potentially operate from different prepared positions. This creates uncertainty for an opposing force. An adversary may know that a particular region contains coastal defense units without knowing exactly where the launchers are located at a particular moment. That uncertainty can complicate planning. It can also force an opposing naval force to devote additional resources to surveillance and defensive measures. This is one reason coastal missile systems are often described as force multipliers. They do not replace warships. Instead, they can make the entire maritime defense system more difficult to challenge. The larger picture becomes even more interesting when BrahMos is considered alongside the Philippines' other modernization programs. The Philippine Navy is acquiring and developing new surface combatants. The Philippine Air Force continues to expand its capabilities. The Coast Guard is increasing its presence around the country's maritime territory. The Army is developing additional coastal defense assets. Individually, these programs provide different capabilities. Together, they can create layers. A hostile surface force approaching Philippine waters could potentially be monitored by surveillance systems, observed by aircraft or unmanned platforms, tracked by naval or Coast Guard assets, and placed at risk by shore-based missile units. The Navy could provide another layer of response. Aircraft could provide additional surveillance and combat capability, and coastal defense batteries could give commanders another option without requiring a warship to physically move into the most dangerous area. This is the broader concept behind modern anti-access and area denial strategies. The goal is not necessarily to build a fleet that can match a larger naval power ship for ship. Instead, the objective is to make hostile. The Philippines has one major advantage that cannot simply be purchased from a foreign manufacturer: geography. The country is an archipelago. Its islands are separated by strategic waterways, narrow passages, and enormous stretches of ocean. That means military planners can potentially position defensive assets around key approaches. However, geography is also a challenge. Moving personnel and equipment between islands is difficult. Maintaining military infrastructure across thousands of islands can be expensive. Communications can be complicated. Weather can disrupt operations. And maintaining a large force in tropical maritime conditions requires constant logistics and maintenance. So while the Philippines has enormous geographic depth, turning that geography into an effective defense system requires substantial investment. This brings us back to the reported target of 9 BrahMos batteries. If the Philippine Army eventually reaches that number, the country would possess a much more substantial shore-based anti-ship network than it does today. The exact distribution of those batteries would be a crucial question. Strategically important coastal regions could receive priority. Some units could potentially protect important approaches, while others could reinforce areas considered particularly vulnerable. The objective would be to create overlapping defensive coverage rather than relying on one isolated location. However, it is important not to assume that 9 batteries automatically means 9 identical defensive zones. The actual effectiveness of the force would depend on many factors: training, readiness, targeting information, communications, logistics, surveillance, maintenance, and most importantly, how the Army integrates the system with the Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, and other elements of the armed forces of the Philippines. Modern warfare is increasingly about networks rather than individual weapons. This is perhaps the most important part of the story. The BrahMos program should not be viewed simply as a missile acquisition. It is part of a much larger transformation. For many years, the Philippines faced major capability gaps across almost every branch of its military. The country had relatively limited modern combat aircraft, a small surface fleet, limited long-range surveillance capabilities, and only a modest coastal defense capability. That situation is gradually changing. New frigates are entering service. New aircraft are being acquired. The Army is developing missile units. The Coast Guard is expanding. Surveillance capabilities are improving. And new defense partnerships are giving the Philippines access to technologies that were previously beyond its reach. The result is an armed forces of the Philippines that is slowly becoming more interconnected. The challenge now is ensuring that all these individual capabilities can communicate and operate together. If the Philippines continues expanding its BrahMos force, several developments could become increasingly important. The first is training. Missile crews must be able to operate their systems under realistic conditions and maintain readiness over long periods. The second is surveillance. The Philippines will need increasingly capable systems to monitor its enormous maritime environment. The third is command and control. Information has to move quickly between sensors, commanders, naval forces, aircraft, and ground units. The fourth is logistics. A sophisticated missile system is only useful if it can be maintained, supplied, transported, and kept operational. And finally, there is integration. The most powerful coastal defense force would not operate independently. It would become one component of a broader Philippine maritime security architecture. There is also a broader message behind this modernization. The Philippines is moving away from a defense posture focused primarily on internal security and toward one that increasingly considers conventional external threats. That does not mean the country is preparing for war. It means the military is attempting to build credible capabilities that can protect Philippine territory and maritime interests in a changing strategic environment. For an archipelago surrounded by strategically important waters, that requires more than warships. It requires aircraft. It requires surveillance. It requires Coast Guard vessels. It requires resilient communications. And increasingly, it requires mobile land-based missile systems. The BrahMos is therefore just one piece of a much larger puzzle. If the Philippine Army ultimately fields 9 batteries, the country's coastline could become significantly more difficult for hostile surface forces to operate against. But the real transformation will come from how those batteries connect with everything else. A missile system can provide firepower. A sensor can provide information. A warship's The Philippines is still a long way from having a completely integrated maritime defense network. There will be challenges involving funding, training, infrastructure, maintenance, manpower, and geography. But the direction is becoming increasingly clear. The country is building a layered defense structure designed around its greatest geographic reality. It is an archipelago surrounded by strategically important seas. And if the reported plan for 9 BrahMos batteries becomes reality, the Philippine Army could become an increasingly important part of the country's maritime defense. The significance is not simply the number of missiles. It is the ability to create a wider network of sensors, launchers, ships, aircraft, and personnel capable of working together. For the Philippines, that could represent one of the most important changes in its approach to coastal defense in decades. As military modernization continues, the question will no longer be whether the Philippines has individual modern weapons. The bigger question will be whether it can successfully connect those weapons into one coordinated national defense system. And if that happens, the country's thousands of islands may become not just a geographic challenge to defend, but a major strategic advantage. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown of Philippine military modernization, make sure to subscribe for more updates on the Philippine Army, Philippine Navy, BrahMos, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and developments across the Indo-Pacific. And let us know in the comments, do you think the Philippines should continue expanding its BrahMos Coastal Defense Force to protect more areas of the archipelago? Until next time, stay informed and keep following the modernization of the Armed Forces of the Philippines.